$7.7 billion. That is the value of the canola complex Canada sold into the American market in 2024. Seed, oil, and meal combined, crossing the border every week of the year by rail car and tanker, feeding American dairy cows, fueling American renewable diesel refineries, coating American snack food. In the oil that makes the cracker slide off the assembly line and land in a supermarket bag with no country of origin listed anywhere on the front panel, 7.7 billion flowing quietly through a supply chain. And so integrated that the average American food manufacturer, the average American dairy farmer, and the average American biofuel operator had, until the trade war made the dependency visible, never spent a single morning thinking about where the canola came from or what it would cost if someone tried to shut it off with a Truth Social post on a Saturday morning in January. That post arrived on January 24th of 2026. It was written by the President of the United States. It threatened a 100% tariff on all Canadian goods and products entering the United States if Canada proceeded with the trade deal it had just concluded with China. 100%, not the 25% that had been the baseline tariff threat since February of 2025. Not the 35% that the administration had layered on in August of 2025. 100%, a rate that if applied to canola products alone would have functionally closed the border to every gram of Canadian oil, meal, and seed heading south. The man making the threat referred to the Canadian Prime Minister not as Prime Minister, but as Governor, playing off his repeated claim that Canada should become the 51st American state. And the commodity sitting at the center of what he threatened to eliminate was the protein supplement feeding the cows that produce the milk in every dairy state in the Union. I'm Mike Carter. This is the Decision Room, where we break down the geopolitical, military, and economic decisions that shape the world. No filler, no spin, just the story told straight. To understand what a 100% tariff on Canadian canola would actually do to the American farm economy, you need to understand what canola meal is, who buys it, and why there is no domestic American substitute at the volume the American livestock industry now depends on. Because this is not a story about bilateral trade diplomacy. It is a story about protein, specifically the 36% protein content of a processed oilseed byproduct that lands in the feed ration of American dairy cows in Wisconsin and California and New York at a price point that makes it more cost-effective than almost any alternative animal feed protein available in the continental market. Canola meal is the solid material that remains after the oil is extracted from canola seed. The extraction process, whether by solvent or mechanical pressing, removes approximately 44% of the seed's weight in oil, leaving behind a protein-rich cake that is dried, ground, and sold in bulk as an animal feed ingredient. Canola meal is the second most widely traded protein feed ingredient in the world after soybean meal. It contains between 34 and 36% crude protein, a favorable amino acid profile, and a palatability advantage over rapeseed meal because Canadian plant breeders eliminated the glucosinolates, the bitter compounds present in traditional rapeseed during the same breeding program that produced canola oil in 1972. The near-complete removal of glucosinolates from the meal portion of canola produces a feed ingredient that is not just tolerable to livestock, but actively preferred by dairy cattle whose milk production responds measurably to its inclusion in the ration. Studies documented by the U.S. Canola Association and the Canola Council of Canada confirm consistently that including canola meal in dairy cow rations increases milk production by approximately 1 liter per cow per day, 1 liter per cow per day in a commercial dairy herd of 1,000 cows, a moderate scale. Operation by Wisconsin standards, that is 1,000 additional liters of milk per day from the same herd, the same labor, and the same capital infrastructure, simply from the feed ingredient. That productivity advantage is why American dairy farmers buy Canadian canola meal, not because it is cheap, because it works. The scale of the dependency is captured in a single statistic from 2024. 66% of all Canadian canola meal exports in 2024 were shipped to the United States. Canada exported the bulk of its canola meal production south of the border year after year, building a supply relationship with American dairy and poultry and swine producers that had been growing steadily since the mid 200s and had reached a level of integration by 2024 that the Manitoba Cooperator described in April of 2026 with a single clear summary. The US market was worth 5.7 billion Canadian dollars in canola sales last year, and that figure covers not just the oil flowing into biofuel refineries, but the meal flowing into livestock operations across 36 American states that list Canada as their top export destination. Read that sentence carefully. Canada is the top export destination for 36 American states, not the top import source for 36 states, the top destination for what those states sell. Soy from Iowa goes to Canada, corn from Illinois goes to Canada, pork from North Carolina goes to Canada. The trade relationship is reciprocal in a way that Trump's framing Canada as a dependent, a burden, a drain on American economic strength systematically failed to describe. And at the center of the reciprocal system going in the opposite direction is the canola meal that goes south into American livestock operations. The canola oil that goes south into American food manufacturing and biofuel production, and the canola seed that goes south in smaller volumes into specialized processing facilities that extract its oil for food and industrial uses. Now walk the sequence of events that produced the January 24th threat, because the sequence explains both the threat and why it did not materialize in the form Trump described. On March 20th of 2025, China imposed a 100% tariff on Canadian canola oil and meal, retaliating for Canada's decision in October of 2024 to mirror American tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. The canola oil and meal tariffs followed Canada's imposition of 100% duties on Chinese EV imports, policy decision taken to align with American trade posture at American encouragement. In a context where both Washington and Ottawa were coordinating on restricting Chinese automotive subsidies from undercutting North American assembly workers, China responded by targeting the Canadian commodity. It knew best, the one that had once made up 65% of China's canola imports before the 2019 diplomatic freeze over the Huawei extradition case had already fractured the relationship once before. In August of 2025, China added a 75.8% anti-dumping tariff on Canadian canola seed itself, the most severe of the measures, which landed on the rock crop that Saskatchewan and Alberta producers had been trying to redirect since March. Together, the two waves the 100% on oil and meal. From March, the 75.8% on seed from August, effectively closed the Chinese market to Canadian canola products. Exports to China that had once accounted for 65% of Canadian canola seed volumes collapsed to near zero. The farm gate price in Saskatchewan fell approximately 9% in the weeks. Following the August announcement, storage facilities across the prairies filled faster than the diversification capacity of alternative markets could absorb. Mark Carney understood when he took office in March of 2025 that Canada was being squeezed simultaneously from both sides. Washington was tariffing the southern flow. Beijing was tariffing the eastern flow. The canola sector was caught between two trade wars it had not started and could not win through passive resistance. The strategic response Carney chose was to resolve the Beijing problem directly and use the resolution as a demonstration of diplomatic capacity to the Washington audience watching from the South. In January of 2026, Carney traveled to Beijing. The visit produced a formal strategic partnership between Canada and China, the first significant reset of the bilateral trade relationship in nearly a decade. The terms that mattered for Canadian agriculture were specific and measurable. China agreed to reduce tariffs on Canadian canola seed to a combined rate of approximately 15%, down from the 75.8% peak effective March 1st of 2026. China also committed to exempting Canadian canola meal, lobsters, crabs, and peas from anti-discrimination tariffs until at least the end of 2026. In exchange, Canada agreed to allow up to 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles into the Canadian market annually, a modest concession that did not represent a free trade agreement, did not remove Canada's baseline EV tariffs, and explicitly complied with Canada's obligations under COSMA by not creating a transshipment route for Chinese goods to reach the American market. Canada also set a formal goal of increasing exports to China by 50% by 2030, a diversification target designed to reduce the structural dependency on the American market that the trade war had made dangerously visible. The morning after the strategic partnership was announced, Trump posted his threat. If Governor Carney thinks he is going to make Canada a drop-off port for China to send goods and products into the United States, he is sorely mistaken, Trump wrote on Truth Social on January 24th. If Canada makes a deal with China, it will immediately be hit with a 100% tariff against all Canadian goods and products coming into the United States. 3 points about that post deserve careful attention. The first is what it was about. The threat was triggered by Canada's canola deal with China, a deal that lowered Chinese tariffs on Canadian agricultural products and allowed a modest number of Chinese electric vehicles into the Canadian market. There was no transshipment agreement. There was no Chinese goods routing through Canada to reach American buyers. Canada's own finance minister, Dominic LeBlanc, posted the same day to confirm there is no pursuit of a free trade agreement with China. What has been achieved is a resolution on several important tariff issues. Carney himself said it the following day. Canada respects its COSMA obligations and will not pursue a free trade agreement without notifying the other two parties. The framing of Canada as a Chinese drop-off port was not supported by the terms of the agreement that prompted it. The second point is what a 100% tariff on all Canadian goods would actually do to the American farm sector that voted for the administration imposing it. Canada is the top export destination for 36 American states. The Canadian market buys American soy, American corn, American pork, American beef, American manufactured goods, American auto parts, and it pays for that buying in part with the canola oil and meal it sends south in exchange. A 100% tariff on all Canadian imports would trigger Canadian retaliatory measures that would target American agricultural exports into Canada with the same precision that Canada had already demonstrated in earlier rounds. Bourbon from Kentucky, orange juice from Florida, steel from Pennsylvania, and would close the Canadian market to American farm products that currently cross the border under COSMA's duty-free provisions. The third point is the arithmetic of what a 100% tariff on canola products specifically would do to the American dairy sector. In 2024, 66% of Canada's canola meal exports went to American dairy farms. The meal is feeding cows in Wisconsin, California, New York, Idaho, and Michigan, the states that produce the majority of American fluid milk and cheese. A 100% tariff on canola meal does not immediately switch American dairy farmers to a different protein supplement. It makes the supplement they are currently using twice as expensive at the border, forcing them to either absorb the cost in their milk price economics or switch to soybean meal, an alternative that is available in larger volumes, but whose protein profile and palatability characteristics are different enough from canola meal that the productivity premium, the 1 extra liter per cow per day, disappears. American soybean meal is available. The American soybean crush industry produced at elevated capacity in 2025 and 2026, expanding output to meet both the biofuel feedstock demand pulling soy oil north and the animal feed demand pulling soy meal in multiple directions. But the protein market is not interchangeable. The way an economist model of competing inputs suggests, canola meal is preferred in dairy rations for reasons that go beyond price. The amino acid profile, the specific protein fractions, digestibility, the absence of anti-nutritional factors that limit inclusion rates in other oilseed meals. These are nutritional realities that American dairy nutritionists did not engineer around when they formulated the rations their clients feed today. Switching from canola meal to soybean meal at the volumes the American dairy industry currently uses requires reformulation of rations across thousands of farms, recalibration of nutritional models, and acceptance of the productivity loss that comes from removing the specific protein fraction. Canola meal provides for a commercial dairy farmer running on 2% margins. That is not a rounding error. It is a decision that affects whether the operation is viable. The response to the threat came from a sequence of people who were not Prime Minister Carney. Inu Manek, senior fellow for international trade at the Council on Foreign Relations, told CNN it sounded like Trump was lashing out at Carney for stealing the limelight at Davos, where Carney's speech, characterizing the current global moment as a rupture, not a transition, had generated more international commentary than anything the American delegation had produced. York University analyst Stephen Clarkson said Trump's threat illustrated how erratic and unreliable a trade policy is at that moment. And the American agricultural community, whose export interests in the Canadian market were directly at risk from any Canadian retaliation 100% tariff would inevitably trigger, did not need to make its position public to make it felt. Canada is the top export destination for 36 U.S. states. Farm state senators know what that number means. The 100% threat did not materialize. Canada proceeded with the China partnership announcement as described. The canola deal took effect on March 1st of 2026. Carney posted a video saying Canadians should focus on what they can control. LeBlanc called for constructive engagement. The threat was filed in the category that investors had already labeled Taco Trump always chickens out, and the canola continued to cross the border under the CUSMA exemption that had shielded the bulk of Canadian agricultural exports from the tariff layers underneath it. But the threat's failure to materialize did not mean it had no effect. The effect was felt immediately in the grain markets. When the 100% post landed on January 24th, canola futures moved. A Saskatchewan farmer named Darren Johnson told Farm No that the China deal had pushed canola from about $12.80 a bushel to over $14, and that Trump's threat arriving the morning after that price movement was read by farmers as an attempt to suppress the gain. He had been holding last year's crop, waiting for better prices. The China deal was finally giving him the price signal he needed. The Trump post threatened. To take it away, Johnson's verdict was practical rather than diplomatic. He did not agree with the way China mediates in politics, he said, but farmers do not have the luxury of ideology when bills are due. That line carries more strategic content than its directness. Suggests the Canadian prairie farming community, which had been the social and electoral base of conservative politics in Canada for a generation, was being pushed by the combined pressure of American and Chinese tariffs on its primary export crop toward a strategic conclusion that its political loyalties had previously made difficult to reach, that market diversification away from both Washington and Beijing was not a policy preference but a survival necessity, and that the Canadian government, willing to pursue it most aggressively, deserved support regardless of its partisan stripe. Carney's Liberal government won the April 25th federal election in 2026, with a majority built partly on prairie seats that had not gone Liberal in years, and the canola file was one of the reasons. 12.66 billion Canadian dollars. That is what the canola sector contributed to Canada's total export value in 2025 across all markets, seed, oil, and meal combined. The industry as a whole contributes 43.7 billion Canadian dollars annually to the national economy. It supports more than 100,000 jobs in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Alberta. It is the largest single agricultural export commodity that Canada produces, and the most politically sensitive because the farmers who grow it are concentrated in the prairie provinces that have historically been the most skeptical of federal intervention in agricultural markets and the most supportive of free trade with the United States. When those farmers concluded that the American trade partner they had built their export strategy around had become an unreliable buyer, not because of market conditions, but because of political decisions made in weekend social media posts, the political realignment that conclusion produced was not symbolic, it was structural. Now look at the leverage map that the $7.7 billion number actually describes and follow the number all the way to the end. Canada exported 2.4747 million metric tons of canola oil and 4.13 million metric tons of canola meal to the United States in 2025. The oil flows into biofuel refineries and food manufacturing plants, a story documented extensively in the renewable diesel feedstock dependency built over the past 4 years. The meal flows into something closer to home and harder to replace on any calendar relevant to a trade negotiation. The daily feed ration of American dairy cows in the highest production states in the country. Wisconsin has approximately 1.2 million dairy cows. California has approximately 1.6 million. New York has approximately 570,000. Idaho has approximately 590,000. These are the four largest fluid milk producing states in the continental United States. And their dairy nutritionists have spent the past decade increasingly including Canadian canola meal in the rations formulated for the breeds primarily Holstein, whose milk production economics justify the cost of a premium protein ingredient. The 1 liter per cow per day productivity advantage that the U.S. Canola Association and the Canola Council of Canada both document is not a marketing claim. It is a function of the specific amino acid profile of canola meal, particularly its methionine and lysine content that complements the protein fractions in corn and soybean-based rations in ways that improve both milk yield and milk protein percentage. American dairy nutritionists know this. The farms that switched to canola meal inclusion did so because the math worked. The farms that would be forced to switch back to a soybean-only ration under a 100% tariff on canola would feel the milk production consequence within the first feeding cycle. None of this appeared in Trump's January 24th post. The post mentioned China. It mentioned a drop-off port. It mentioned that China would eat Canada alive. It did not mention dairy cows. It did not mention protein rations. It did not mention that the commodity it was threatening to block at the border had worked its way over. 30 years of continental integration into the nutritional foundation of the American dairy industry at a depth that no executive order can redirect in a week or a month or a year. The United States produced approximately 678,000 metric tons of primary aluminum in 2024. A comparison that has become standard in discussions of continental dependency, but the canola dependency is more intimate than the aluminum one. Aluminum goes into finished goods at a remove from the final consumer. Canola meal goes into the cow that produces the milk that goes into the cheese and the butter and the fluid milk that sits in an American refrigerator. The distance between the Saskatchewan field and the American dairy counter is longer in kilometers than it appears in the supply chain. RBC's December 2025 analysis of Canadian agricultural export risk put the overall picture in a single sentence. Roughly 96% of Canada's canola oil and 65% of canola meal export volumes went to the United States in 2024. 96% of one commodity, 65% of another. The concentration was not built in a year. It was built across 30 years of integration under free trade agreements that made continental specialization rational and economically optimal for producers on both sides of the border. The Canadian crush industry was built to supply American biofuel refineries. The Canadian canola meal supply chain was built to supply American dairy farms. Both were built on the assumption that the trade policy governing the relationship would remain stable. rules-based and mutually reinforcing. That assumption did not survive the morning of January 24th. What Carney did between January 24th and the end of the first quarter of 2026 was not a series of reactions. It was an execution of a strategy that had been forming since he took office. Use every pressure event as an opportunity to accelerate the diversification that was already underway without allowing any single threat to define the terms of Canada's response. The China deal was signed before the 100% tariff threat arrived, not as a response to the threat, but as a calculated demonstration that Canada was willing to pursue its own economic interests, regardless of whether Washington approved. The threat landed the morning after the deal. Because the deal had already happened, Carney's response to the threat was to post a video about what Canadians can control. What Canada controlled was its ability to sign the deal. What it could not control was the weekend posting schedule of the American president. Three paths open from this. The first is a COSMA bilateral settlement that includes a canola and agricultural sector framework, one that restores formal duty-free clarity to canola oil, seed, and meal, formalizes the canola meal supply relationship in a way that gives American dairy farmers the policy certainty to continue building their feed programs around Canadian protein, and removes the 100% tariff threat as an active instrument. This is the path that the economics of both the American dairy sector and the Canadian prairie farming sector argue for. Its probability depends on whether the COSMA review, which missed its July 1st renewal deadline and is now operating on an annual review track, produces a sectoral agreement in time for the American midterm election cycle to use it as a political win. The second, the status quo, persists through the midterms.